Okay, folks, we are back. Hopefully, you are still on the live recording. I do these things live because I like to know that we are communicating in real time. But we lost audio on the last one, and we are restarting because we're not going to let this thing stop us here. So here's what I want to recap. Today's episode of the Justice Briefing is about how Black history teaches us to resist authoritarianism. How Black history teaches us to resist authoritarianism. This has been my theme all month long during Black History Month. And I want to go through four lessons about how Black history teaches us to resist authoritarianism. So the first lesson is learn who the Nazis got it from. The second lesson is practice narrative resistance. The third lesson is build independent institutions. And the fourth lesson is practice political realism. Learn who the Nazis got it from, practice narrative resistance, build independent institutions, practice narrative realism. If you're just tuning in, I want to recap number one, learn who the Nazis got it from. So there's this book that you need to pick up called Hitler's American Model by James Q. Whitman. Hitler's American Model by James Q. Whitman. And in that book, he talks about a group of Nazi lawyers gathering in 1934 to write the Nuremberg Laws. These were anti-Semitic policies designed to control and suppress the Jewish people, the Nuremberg Laws. And where did they get their model? Where did they get their inspiration? From the Jim Crow era of the United States, right from the US. So all of this is in the context of how do we resist authoritarianism? You don't have to go to 1930s Germany. As a matter of fact, they came to us. They looked at the United States and Jim Crow laws to get a model for how to write discrimination into law and policy. And what I was saying before, the Nuremberg laws primarily focused on two issues, citizenship and interracial sex. So for a long time, Black people were not considered citizens in the United States. You can go all the way back to Dred Scott versus Sanford. And the judge said that white men do not have to respect any laws, any rights of Black people because they were enslaved. They were property. And that persisted all the way through the Civil War. It took a constitutional amendment, the 15th Amendment, to make sure that Black people could be citizens and could vote, Black men at that time. And so the Nazis were looking, well, how do you disenfranchise people? How do you say that people aren't even citizens? How do you say that they don't belong? And that's one of the laws they look at. The other one was interracial sex. In the United States, it was called miscegenation. That's an old-timey word for race mixing, as they called it. It's an old-timey word for interracial marriage, interracial sex, miscegenation, or an even grosser word, they called it mongrelization. Mongrelization. So you hear that term, that's from the Jim Crow era, and it's talking about mainly Black men having sex and babies with white women. Now, the reverse was never an issue. Right? Going all the way back to chattel slavery, white enslavers assaulted Black women at will. And somehow that was never an issue. But if it was a Black man and a white woman, that was the issue. Well, in the same way, Nazi Germany was like, well, how do we make sure that Jewish people and so-called Aryans don't get together? They wanted to maintain a pure Aryan race, and so they created laws against interracial marriage and interracial sex. And they developed those laws, modeled them after Jim Crow laws in the United States. So why are you going to 1930s Germany to learn how to resist authoritarianism without recognizing that 1930s Nazis looked to the United States for how to implement authoritarian laws? So let's understand that history first. But the reverse is also true. It wasn't just the Nazis that learned from the US, it was resistors who learned from the US. And so there's another book I'll commend to you. It's called Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. And that's by Reggie L. Williams. And he talks about this incredible period in Dietrich Bonhoeffer's life. You know Dietrich Bonhoeffer, theologian, pastor, member of the Confessing Church that tried to resist Nazi Germany and the churches that were complicit with it. Dietrich Bonhoeffer had a final year of graduate study. Mind you, he had already earned his PhD, and as Reggie Williams says, had written a second dissertation. This man's mind for writing and academics was off the charts. But he was in a final year of grad school, and he came to the United States. And he didn't go just anywhere in the United States. He went to New York City. And there was sort of a practicum, a volunteer kind of program that he was part of. And he was doing that work at a historic black church called Abyssinian Church in New York City, in Harlem, to be precise. Reggie L. Williams, the author of the book, said that Williams, the author of the book, said that Bonhoeffer wanted to, quote, learn theology as it has developed under completely different circumstances than our own in Germany. So Bonhoeffer was intentionally looking to a different context to understand how they developed theology, and he looked to the black church. Williams goes on to argue in his book that Bonhoeffer encountered black Jesus. Not a phenotypically black Jesus. We're not talking about skin color, but we're talking about black Jesus as a Jesus who sides with the oppressed. So he says that this black Jesus theology reframed Bonhoeffer's understanding of Christ, embedding concrete historical solidarity with suffering people into his ethic of resistance. In other words, Christian resistance to authoritarianism doesn't come from abstract doctrine alone, but by proximity to oppressed communities who are living out the gospel under pressure. That's what Bonhoeffer saw in Harlem. That's what he saw at Abyssinian. And so it says to us that resistance theology must be rooted in the concrete struggle of oppressed communities. That's our first lesson. Learn who the Nazis got it from. Also learn who the Confessing Church got it from. It was the United States, and particularly authoritarian laws designed to disenfranchise and marginalize black people, as well as resistance theology from the black church. Lesson number 2, how black history teaches us to resist authoritarianism. Lesson number 2, practice narrative resistance. Practice narrative resistance. Authoritarians don't begin by seizing political power. They begin by seizing the story. Authoritarians don't start by seizing political power. They start by seizing the story. And so resistance to authoritarianism must take back the story. What is narrative resistance? This is how I define it. Narrative resistance is the deliberate act of truth-telling about history, power, and lived experience when those in authority depend on distortion, silence, or myth to maintain control. Narrative resistance is the deliberate act of truth-telling about history, power, and lived experience when those in authority depend on distortion, silence, or myth to maintain control. So, as my example of narrative resistance, I want to tell you about Ida B. Wells Barnett. Of course, you know Ida B. Wells. But do you know her backstory? Do you know her origin story, if you will? So she's born in 1862 in Holly Springs, Mississippi. I've been there. It was on my way to and from the University of Mississippi when I was getting my PhD. Very small town in northern Mississippi. Tragically, Ida B. Wells' parents were both killed by yellow fever. And she was the oldest. She was kind of left taking care of her younger siblings. She first became a teacher and then a writer, and then, as we now know her, an investigative journalist. Now, how did that happen? There was a lynching that changed everything. There was a lynching that changed everything. So in 1892, Ida B. Wells was living in Memphis, Tennessee. And on March 9th, three of Wells's close friends, Thomas Moss, Calvin McDonald, and Henry Stewart, were lynched by a white mob. Why were they lynched? Basically, because they were successful black businessmen. They owned a black grocery store, and the success of that black grocery store was threatening the white-owned competitor, another grocery store. And so essentially their crime was running a successful black-owned business. White people could not stand to see black people prospering, especially if it meant equal competition. You understand that white business owners were used to having a monopoly. They were used to being able to crowd out black businesses or shut them down completely so that there wasn't any competition. And folk want to make a big deal about affirmative action and whatnot, because they say, "Oh, we just want people to get jobs based on merit." This white grocery store owner wasn't successful based on merit. He was successful by lynching his competition. Let's talk about merit. Anyway, I digress. So these were Ida B. Wells's friends. And in the aftermath, Wells told the truth about the lynching, and she went further. She indicted the white newspapers for whitewashing the story. You understand that the press at this time was largely white-owned, and they were allied with the white power structure. So when a lynching occurred, they completely twisted the story to always make it seem like black people had done something wrong and they deserved the death penalty. Without trial, without a jury of their peers, without the law. So that's what the white newspapers were doing, and Ida B. Wells called them out. She wrote that, quote, "They had helped make this trouble by fanning the flames of race prejudice, which encouraged, aided, and abetted the lynching." They helped to make this trouble by fanning the flames of race prejudice. In the aftermath of that lynching of those three black business owners, hundreds of black people fled Memphis, which, by the way, we call it the Great Migration. We have to understand that black people were internal refugees. Black people were internal refugees fleeing from persecution in their own nation. It wasn't just, oh, we'll go find job opportunities and housing elsewhere. That was some of it. But a lot of it was they were fleeing the terrorism and violence and lynching of the South. And if you leave your homeland to go to someplace you presume or hope is safer, that is a refugee, folks. Again, we don't think of enslavement, voter suppression, authoritarian laws, lynchings as authoritarianism. We think it's just like U.S. history or racism. It is, but these are also forms of authoritarianism, which is why we need to learn from black history about how to resist it. There's more. So when Ida B. Wells wrote about the complicity and the active participation of white newspapers, and then hundreds of people are leaving Memphis, they're like, why are all the black people leaving Memphis? We're good to our black people. We have harmonious relations between the races, and they had to find a scapegoat, and they chose Ida B. Wells and her writing and her newspaper. So her newspaper was called The Free Speech. They blamed her, and they blamed this black-owned paper for being divisive. Does that sound familiar? You're being divisive. And what did they do? They destroyed the paper, and Ida B. Wells was out of town at the time. They told her, if you come back, we're going to kill you. They threatened her life for writing the truth. Imagine. We have endured death threats just for telling the truth. And that goes on to this day. I'm reminded of Don Lemon and Georgia Fort, two journalists who were arrested simply for covering the protest at this church outside of Minneapolis, where one of the church leaders is a higher up in ICE. And these are journalists. They weren't participating in the protest. They were covering the protest, and yet they were arrested for telling the truth. This is Black History Today, folks. Okay, here's how Ida B. Wells responded. She didn't shrink back. She said, having lost my paper, had a price put on my life, and been made an exile from home for hinting at the truth, I felt that I owed it to myself and to my race to tell the whole truth now that I was where I could do so freely. Did you catch that? She said, I lost my job. They put a price on my life. They exiled me from my home for the crime, so-called crime, of hinting at the truth, as she put it. What did she do? She said, I owed it to myself and to my race and to Black people to tell the whole truth now that I was where I could do so freely. So she didn't flee just for comfort or safety. She left so she could tell the truth even more boldly. Well, that's another lesson, is around courage, but that's for another time. So this is all about practice narrative resistance. In every era, those with the most money and the most power try to dominate the loudest outlets. Media, social media, politics, education, religion. We're seeing it right now. Paramount buying up all of these Hollywood outlets, all these movie-making outlets. We're seeing it right now. Billionaires owning or buying up social media outlets, Meta, Twitter/X. We're seeing it. CBS News appoints a far-right chief, right? We're seeing it in newspapers. We're seeing a flood of journalists having to move to places like Substack and start their own independent publications because they're being silenced. This is authoritarianism meted out against narratives, against truth. And so we must practice narrative resistance. Are you hearing me? We must narrate our own lives. We must tell the stories of our strength, of our resistance, of our resilience. And these are the truths that counter the lies. So even if oppressed people have no other resource, they always have their stories. They always have the truth they can tell. As Ida B. Wells put it with characteristic clarity, tell the world the facts. Tell the world the facts. Authoritarians fear narrative resistance because once people can name what's happening to them and share that truth widely, control becomes fragile and power must rely on force rather than consent. So far, we have looked at learning where the Nazis got it from, and secondly, practice narrative resistance. Third up, how Black history teaches us to resist authoritarianism. Build independent institutions. Build independent institutions. So throughout U.S. history, something remarkable has happened. Black people have been repeatedly betrayed by the institutions that were supposed to help them. And yet, studying the past shows us that Black people did not abandon institutions altogether. Instead, they built their own. Black people have been repeatedly betrayed by the institutions that were supposed to help them. From the federal government to the Supreme Court to the U.S. military to schools. I mean, you name it. You name it. In their origin, in their roots, so many institutions that are supposed to be positive and beneficial were designed not to help Black people, sometimes to outright oppress Black people. And yet, Black people We didn't just throw up our hands and say all institutions are bad, they can't do anything good, we are going to be completely anti-institutional, we'll just be individualistic. That was not the response. The response was to build better institutions. There are people who are now so cynical about the betrayal of institutions that they don't think institutions have any value whatsoever. And I understand where the frustration's coming from. I mean, we're seeing churches, Catholic and Protestant, with decades of covering up sexual abuse and protecting predators. We're seeing right now the Department of Justice cover up what some are calling the largest international sex trafficking ring in the world with the Epstein files. We're seeing all kinds of institutions not doing what they're supposed to do, betraying people, hurting people, harming people. So I get it. But have we learned nothing from Black history? You see, because we have historic Black institutions to counter institutions that have failed them, betrayed them, worked against them. Black institutions such as historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs. Black institutions such as Black fraternities and sororities. Black institutions such as the Black church. We can go on and on and on. I just think it's interesting that instead of giving up on institutions altogether, Black people built independent ones. And let me give you an example. So we go to Howard Law School. Well, we go to Howard University, and Howard has a law school. But before we get to that, which is an independent institution, it's an HBCU. But before we get to that, have you heard of Thurgood Marshall? Have you heard of Thurgood Marshall? Of course you have. First Black Supreme Court justice. Have you heard of Brown versus the Board of Education? Of course you have. 1954 decision that said racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. And that case, of course, was argued by Thurgood Marshall. But have you heard of Thurgood Marshall's mentor and one of the architects of the legal strategy that led to Brown v. Board? His name is Charles Hamilton Houston. Charles Hamilton Houston. He was born, Black man, born in 1895. His father was a doctor, mother was a homemaker. They lived in D.C. They were devout Christians. So Hamilton Houston had a lot going for him. He goes to Amherst College in Massachusetts and graduates as one of their valedictorians. Then he joins the U.S. Army. And he experiences racism and discrimination of such a degree that it would alter the trajectory of his life. In the U.S. military, where everyone is serving their country, putting their lives on the line, sacrificing time and career and the ability to be close to family in service to a greater cause, Black people were treated as second-class citizens. And this infuriated Charles Hamilton Houston. He said, quote, "I made up my mind that I would never get caught again without knowing something about my rights. And I would study law and use my time fighting for men who couldn't strike back." So in the Army, when Hamilton Houston is experiencing this racism, he felt powerless. Like he didn't know the law. He didn't know his rights. He didn't know his recourses. And so instead of becoming discouraged or cynical, he said, I made up my mind. I'd never get caught again without knowing something about my rights. And I'll study law and use my time fighting for people who can't fight for themselves. And so he goes to law school, not just any law school. He goes to Harvard Law School. And at Harvard Law School, he's brilliant. And he becomes the first Black member of the editorial board of the Harvard Law Review. After Harvard, he becomes a law professor at Howard Law School. Now, understand, at the time, Howard Law School is a part-time, unaccredited night school that Charles Hamilton Houston helps turn into a highly respected institution accredited by the American Bar Association. It's one of the top law schools in the country, period, not just for black people. And he is spearheading this effort. But since black people weren't allowed at many of the law schools around the country, many of them flocked to Howard Law School and the tutelage of Charles Hamilton Houston, such that at one time, 25% of all black lawyers were trained at Howard Law School. That's how influential it was. And Charles Hamilton Houston had a massive role to play in that. He said, lawyers have to be, quote, social engineers. What he said in full, a lawyer is either a social engineer or he's a parasite on society. I hope you use that phrase, social engineer, prodigiously, because I think it's going to tick off the far right. They hate the word social, and they hate the word engineer, social engineer, that phrase together. But what Charles Hamilton Houston meant was, you don't come here and learn to be a lawyer and learn the ins and outs of the law just to enrich yourself. You come here, you learn the law, you argue your cases to make society better. That's what Charles Hamilton Houston meant by social engineer. That's what led to his activism. He was lead counsel for the NAACP for a long time. He helped bring these court cases that culminated in Brown v. Board of Education. He died before that case was adjudicated, but he helped create the strategy for it. It was social engineering. Why do I bring up Charles Hamilton Houston? Because he was an institutionalist. He believed in the power of institutions to bring about change. Black people didn't give up on institutions. Oh, ye cynical folks out there. Black people built better ones. Black people built independent ones. And here's the thing about institutions. I believe they have several functions that are difficult to replicate individually. Let me name three. Three functions of institutions. Institutions centralize resources. Institutions shape culture and identity. Institutions create enduring legacies. They centralize resources, shape culture and identity, create enduring legacies. Briefly on each. Centralizing resource. An institution can gather resources, whether people or finances, better than most individuals. Institutions, because of a long history, because of lots of people, because of different weight and credibility, can gather resources the ways individuals can't, and therefore deploy them more effectively. For example, the NAACP bringing court cases tends to be more effective than an individual just trying to do it on their own. This is why I have Tisby Media, right? Like, I'm building an independent media institution because Jemar Tisby, as a content creator, can't do as much as Tisby Media, which is a team of people with multiple verticals, from writing to podcasting to educating to filmmaking. We can bring together resources and deploy them more effectively. In addition, institutions shape culture and identity. In another career, I was a middle school principal. The highlight of the week for me, I don't know about the students, but for me, was every Monday we had a team and family meeting. This is when we would go through announcements, we would set the tone for the week, but most importantly, we would remind students of who we were. Institutions effectively say, this is who we are, this is what we do, this is what we don't do. This is our character, these are our values, these are our principles. Institutions create a cultural identity. And lastly, institutions create enduring legacies. So number one, institutions outlast individuals. Carter G. Woodson known as father of Black history, started the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. This is all the way back in 1915. That organization continues today as ASALH, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Carter G. Woodson also started a publication, the Journal of Negro History, which continues today, the Journal of African American History, JAAH. He also started something called Negro History Week, which continues to this day as Black History Month. All of that is because he started an institution, ASALH, which could outlive him. It created an enduring legacy. In addition, when he died, there were other people to take his place. There were other people who became president. There were other people who carried on the work. So these are the things institutions can do, and why we cannot completely give up on institutions. We must build better ones. We must build independent institutions. And the last word about institutions, institutions cultivate hope. Building institutions is about more than mechanics. It's also about hope. Hope becomes durable when it's shared, when it's resourced, when it's organized. And the most potent challenge an independent institution poses to authoritarians is their ability to cultivate hope that change is possible. Build independent institutions. So we've looked at, learn where the Nazis got it from, practice narrative resistance, build independent institutions. Fourth and finally, practice political realism. Practice political realism. Have you heard of the so-called SAVE Act? Stands for Safeguard American Voter Eligibility. But that's not what it is about. It is voter suppression, 21st century style. What the so-called SAVE Act purports to do is tighten the ID laws for voter registration. It is a solution in search of a problem. Non-citizens already cannot vote. There are already laws against that. And any kind of voter fraud, let alone someone who's not a citizen actually voting, is absolutely minuscule. So minuscule as for this act to be a complete waste of resources. What is the true objective? To put onerous voter identification requirements on people just to register to vote. Essentially to prove their citizenship, right? Which is going to suppress the vote. Because right now, the only way the far right can win is for fewer people to vote. They cannot win on their policies. They cannot win on their merit. So they have to rig the system in their favor. Why do I bring that up? Because we have dealt with voter suppression throughout Black history, throughout U.S. history. Let me tell you about a way around it. We're talking about how Black history teaches us to resist authoritarianism. Let's learn from the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Have you heard of the MFDP? It's a fascinating story. When we fund Tisby Media and you invest in it, namely by subscribing, becoming a paid subscriber, or a founding paid subscriber at jemartisby.substack.com, we can make films about history like this. So let me tell you about the MFDP. We'll start in 1963. By 1963, only 5% of eligible Black voters had registered to vote. 5%. Why? Voter intimidation, literacy tests, lynching. The white power structure, including the state government, had so effectively barred Black participation that only 5% of eligible Black voters had even registered to vote. It's a crime. That is authoritarianism, USA style. Just lock it in your brain. Authoritarianism has also already been in the United States. So in 1963, organizers, pro-democracy, Black organizers, organize a freedom vote. It's a mock election where 80,000 Black people cast a ballot in the gubernatorial election. And it was a protest vote. It was a symbolic vote to say, hey, when given the opportunity at free and fair elections, black people participate. Why did they need a symbolic vote? Number one, only 5% were registered to vote and could vote. And number two, the narrative, remember we talked about narrative resistance, the narrative among white people was black people didn't care about politics. The reason why more people weren't registered, the reason why more black people didn't vote is because they didn't care, they were apathetic, they were ignorant, they were incapable. So the freedom vote said, nah, fam. We will hold our own mock election all the way from registration to campaigning to actual voting, and we will show you that not only will we vote, we are eager to participate in the political process. That had such an electric effect on black people in Mississippi that they formed the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to sort of capture and continue the momentum. So the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was a multiracial coalition of voters in Mississippi whose express purpose was to challenge the seating of the all-white so-called regular delegation from Mississippi at the Democratic National Convention. So understand, at this time, Southern Democrats, nicknamed Dixiecrats, were far-right authoritarians. The Dixiecrats were far-right authoritarians. Why do I say this? Because they barred black people almost completely from the political process. They kept them from voting, which, by the way, is the same thing the far right is trying to do today. That's why we need to learn from black history. You're starting to catch on, folks. All right, so the MFDP organized, they did everything by the book. They made it all the way to the 1964 Democratic National Convention, and they were going head-to-head with this all-white Dixiecrat delegation. It was there that Fannie Lou Hamer gave her famous testimony on the floor of the Credentials Committee, and she says, if the Freedom Party is not seated now, I question America. Is this America? The land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off the hooks because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings in America. The great Fannie Lou Hamer. MLK was in support of the MFDP. He said, quote, any party in the world should be proud to have a delegation such as this seated in their midst, for it is in these saints, in ordinary walks of life, that the true spirit of democracy finds its most profound and abiding expression. I love it when he said, these saints in ordinary walks of life. Saints, because many of them were Christians engaging in the political process. So there is this separation of church and state. There is not, in my view, the separation of faith and politics. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, people like Fannie Lou Hamer, prove it. Their faith motivated their activism. He said, these saints in ordinary walks of life, in other words, grassroots. Do you know the word, the Greek root of the word democracy comes from demos and kratos. Demos means the people, and kratos means power. People, power. Which people? Regular people. Ordinary walks of life. Grassroots folks. That was the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the most profound and abiding expression of the spirit of democracy, as MLK put it. But MLK would later be part of a compromise that was very deflating. So the compromise was, we're not going to sit this whole MFDP delegation. We're going to give you two largely symbolic at-large seats. Fannie Lou Hamer said, we ain't come all this way for no 2 seats. All of us is tired, with her characteristic candor. MLK ended up supporting that compromise, but it wasn't a total defeat. So, number one, the MFDP, even though it didn't get seated as the delegation, it did shed light on rampant voter suppression in Mississippi. And the light, the attention, forced some change. Also, in 1965, the very next year, the Voting Rights Act was passed. the same Voting Rights Act that this regime is now trying to dismantle, was passed partly from pressure that the MFDP put on the United States and the government to have free and fair elections. And then lastly, 4 years later, at the next Democratic National Convention, it was multiracial, and many of the people who participated in the MFDP in 64 were delegates in 1968. So we got to try. But here's the political realism part. The lesson here is practice political realism. How did the MFDP practice political realism? Here's one example. Even after that compromise and what looked like defeat, they went on to support the Democratic candidate for president. They campaigned for Lyndon B. Johnson's presidential bid. Why? Because they recognized that his opponent, Barry Goldwater, an avowed segregationist who opposed the Civil Rights Act, they recognized that the other party and the other party's candidate would be even more harmful to black people and even more harmful to democracy than the Democratic Party that had betrayed them. Hello. You can have all the opinions you want. You can disengage from the political process. You can vote third party, whatever. I'm just saying that if you look at black history, you are seeing a people who time and time again were barred from the political process and or betrayed by the political process. And yet they didn't give up on the political process. They practice a political realism. How could you be a member of the MFDP? You have exerted all of this time, energy, gotten your hopes up. You got so close, only to have your own party give you some bogus compromise deal, and then turn around just a couple of months later and actively campaign for that party's candidate. Because black people know the real deal. We're always choosing the lesser of two evils. You purists out there, black people have almost never, and certainly at the presidential level, almost never had an outspokenly pro-black candidate throughout U.S. history. So what have we had to do? We've had to practice a political realism. We've had to engage a system that was far from perfect and make it better. We have had to work the system until the system worked for us. Democracy survives not because it's flawless, but because people refuse to give up on it. That's political realism. So we've looked at 4 lessons. Learn where the Nazis got it from. Practice narrative resistance. Build independent institutions. And practice political realism. So let me speak, as we close, directly to Christians. Let me speak to the church. I understand that 1930s Germany is a salient example of political authoritarianism, and one that we can learn from as we are on this precipice of authoritarianism right here in the United States, enacted all the way from the White House on down. I recognize that. I also recognize that white Christians will most often look to other white people before they look to black Christians. White Christians will often look to other white Christians in Europe or some other place before they look to black Christians right here in the United States. But understand, what I'm encouraging is not an either or, it's a both and. It's not either you look at 1930s Germany or you look at black history. It's both and. Learn both from what happened in Germany and from what happened in the United States. Learn both from the confessing church and from the black church. Both and, not either or. But, we should interrogate why it is so easy for so many to overlook the black church and black history. I don't think most people are refusing to learn how to resist authoritarianism from the black church and from black people on purpose. But I do think it's a default for a reason. One is simply white-centeredness, that in a white supremacist society, all reference points begin with whiteness. And so that which is known, that which is acceptable, that which is normal among white people, that's the standard. And it takes a lot of intentional effort to go beyond that and learn from other traditions like black history and black Christianity. That's part of it. But here's the other deeper part of it. I think this is a history that a lot of white people don't want to confront. Perhaps white Christians hesitate to learn from the black church because they would have to acknowledge why the black church exists at all. I said in my first book, The Color of Compromise, the reason why we have a black church is because of racism in the white church. Why do we need or have a black church at all? It's not because of some deep doctrinal disputes over the Trinity or Scripture or some theological proposition. It was simply because white people refused to treat black people as equal citizens in the household of God, equal members in the household of God. And so we had to build our own institutions. But that's a history not a lot of white people are ready to confront. White Christians can learn how to resist authoritarianism from the black church, but they would have to admit their historic role in racism and white supremacy that made the black church necessary in the first place. And that, my friends, would require a whole other kind of confessing church. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Justice Briefing. Remember, subscribe, jemartisby.substack.com, share this episode, rate and review. Happy Black History Month, and we'll see you next time.